Capita envisions a future in which children and families can flourish. By prioritizing our youngest children, their families, and their communities, we have the potential to radically transform the fabric of our societies for the long term. In this series of Capita in Conversation, we talk to interviewees from around the world to hear their stories, knowledge, wisdom, and ideas on how to create child and family flourishing. In this episode, Capita Senior Fellow and Instructor in Neurology at Harvard Medical School, Ian Marcus Corbin, speaks with author Jennifer Banks about her book, Natality, Toward a Philosophy of Birth.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the latest Capita Conversation. My name is Ian Corbin. I'm a Senior Fellow at Capita, and I'm very, very pleased to welcome today Jennifer Banks, who is here to talk about her new book, Natality, Toward a Philosophy of Birth, just out from Norton. So Jennifer, welcome. Thanks so much. And could you start us off by just talking for a couple minutes about where the book came from, how you ended up tackling it, and what you're sort of trying to present in it?
Sure, and thank you so much for having me, and thank you for Capita for providing the forum for the conversation. It's great to be here. The book emerged for me somewhat unsurprisingly in the immediate aftermath of having my first child. At the time I was a new editor at Yale Press. I had been there a couple of years and had a short, I think it was 6 weeks unpaid disability leave and came back into the workforce fairly quickly and had an experience of a kind of dissonance between what I had just experienced and the world that I returned to, which seemed to have little space for that experience. And what I was interested in is the stories people tell about birth. You know, if birth is this transformative event, how is it narrated and understood in human life? How has it been processed? What meanings have been ascribed to it in our intellectual, literary, philosophical traditions, in our religions, in the myths that we tell about what a human is, what a human life is? That was what I was interested in. It's the place of birth in a kind of broader human story. At the time, there were a lot of memoirs being written about birth. So birth was being written about quite a bit, but it was either from a medical perspective or from an exclusively personal perspective. And I was really wanted to think about birth on a more civilizational level in terms of a broader sweep of human history. So it's a large topic with strangely and very little material to draw on relative to the enormity of the topic itself. I think the other real difficulty was that birth is, at the center of all of our many of our most important and contentious debates. It's a minefield. It is, on the one hand, a kind of overlooked and ignored topic, and on the other hand, it is, kind of right at the center of our cultural, political life in a very incendiary way. So those were the difficulties, but I undertook it. And the book really began with the discovery of Natality, which I hadn't been a reader of Hannah Arendt's work, but Natality was dropped into a book proposal that I was reading. And it just ensnared me because it seemed to offer the promise of that kind of larger social cultural narrative that I was looking for. And so I began reading Arendt. I decided to entitle the book Natality, which is her term, but the book is really written with the belief that this isn't a term that belongs to Arendt. This is really a companion to the word mortality, which of course we understand as something that is all a part of all of our life experience and understood in so many different ways. I wrote the book as an exploration of the place of birth and the stories we tell about what our lives are and what it means to be alive, what it means to be a human. I have focused on 7 different people that I think provided some of the deepest and richest accounts of birth as an interwoven part of the human condition. All of them have a thread that runs through the work about creativity, as birth is a kind of fundamental creative aspect of our lives that is not at all separable from our mortality and from the destructive part of our lives, but about these two parts of life being held in a certain kind of tenuous and difficult balance. Yes, and the book is really written as an invitation into natality. It's an attempt to kind of develop this framework that welcomes people into the topic and allows us to think about the myriad ways in which birth shapes our lives from beginning to end, whether we have children or don't have children. We have all been born, and birth is something that is continually defining our individual lives and our collective lives.
Great, thank you. Yes, I mean, I guess let's jump in. So you mentioned very rightly that, it's a topic where you have to be careful and you have to be nuanced and serious, in part because it touches on a lot of really hot button political cultural issues, abortion, euthanasia, contraception, eugenics, all sorts of stuff. And you could think of that as like, an unhappy coincidence, right? The thing that I'm interested in is sort of proximal to these landmines. Mm-hmm. I wonder if that's the right way to think about it, though, or whether the fact that we are so exercised about this set of issues is an indication that there's something really fraught and confused about our posture towards nature, birth, and life. How do you understand the fact that your topic, just happens to be proximal to all these sort of political?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it shows just how important birth is, and in a way, how much we care about it and are concerned with it on some level, even if it's not always completely conscious. Mm-hmm. And that there is this split between, on the one hand, birth's kind of seeming like a small topic or a topic for serious intellectual engagement. It's always been kind of minor or submerged or secondary, and yet it's right there. And I think it's huge. And there are different articulations of it, different reasons why it's so important at different periods of history. I think in our own moment, there are these major questions about what a human is, even just in terms of, what separates a human from artificial intelligence. There's also major questions about the nature of humanity. Are we a terrible species? If we are terrible, to be birthing ourselves forward in time is a problem. So, to think about birth, we have to think about these very profound questions about who we are as people. But I feel like, in most of the public discussions, it doesn't really go there. There is a kind of circling around birth. There's a way in which it's hard to really get at the experience. It's circumnavigated in some ways. So the book is trying to kind of go directly there and to not ignore any of the issues or the politics that surround birth, but not to have all of our thinking completely constrained by the categories that dominate the kind of public discussion, the binary thinking, and some of it is advocacy. That there's a lot at stake, and the book wasn't written as advocacy; it was written more as reflection and exploration. So I think that's the kind of level that's needed most urgently.
So, I mean, it's not a pro-life book in the political sense, or in the sort of electoral political sense. Is it pro-life in any other sense?
Well, I will say it is not at all pro-life in the sense of advocating any kind of restriction of abortion access. I am in favor of reproductive rights personally. I would say that the book leans towards life. It does so with an understanding that the questions that might pull one away from birth are very real and they can't just be wiped away. That human life is not always a good thing in all circumstances. That there are really very real power structures and balances, historical conditions that can foreclose the possibilities that birth might otherwise entail. But it really, I think there is a discomfort with antinatalism that also runs through the book, with this idea that, we are at our root a kind of species that needs to be eliminated, or that human life is only about suffering. I think I've tried to bring into focus the joy and the sense of possibility that we really need to have to actually do the work that's needed in our cultures.
Yeah. Who is the, do you remember who is I think it was an ancient Greek, who you mentioned, who says the best thing of all would be to never be alive?
I think that's from Nietzsche, right. The birth of tragedy, the Silenus.
Okay, yeah. Right.
Yeah.
So, I mean, look, we're not at the first moment in history where people have been a little skeptical about this being good, right? Is there something unique? I mean, it does seem to me like the phenomenon of a lot of people saying, like, this stuff that we are and that you are and that, like, my mom is, like, this is bad stuff. This is stuff that shouldn't be around anymore. That seems like a phenomenon needing explanation, right? Like, and as I say, it seems like, not the first time that someone is reflected in this way, but it does seem like there must be a level of sort of self-alienation or something required on a pretty profound level to just want to say, like, this is bad. Like,
yeah.
For there to be people is bad. For there to be more people is even worse. Do you have a kind of working understanding of, like, how we get to this point, like what this means?
Yeah, I mean, most of the traditions that we can trace back, both Western and, Abrahamic, but also Eastern traditions, there's a strong antinatalism that runs through them, certainly in the religious traditions that I'm thinking of, in some of the philosophic traditions. So that it's not a new thing. I would guess, and I don't know that I have any real way to measure this, but that it's accentuated and accelerated in the modern world, and certainly over the last century. Just because I think the possibility of extinction is more real. I think it felt very real to people at different periods of time, but now we feel the pressures of things like nuclear weapons, of environmental crisis, of certainly now AI. And so, some of it is, I feel a kind of laziness in the sense that end seems in a way like a safe bet. It seems like it's kind of destined. And so that it's kind of posed as this sort of provocation, that, oh, humans are terrible and we should be on our way out. But I think one of the things I'm trying to show in the book is how this thinking is actually not that provocative or new or innovative. And in some ways, what is really creative and interesting and difficult and innovative, I think, is work that actually embraces embodiment and a kind of earthly bound existence and tries to think about what kind of life is possible in our present circumstances. So I would buy the argument that there's a kind of alienation that is unique to our moment.
I mean, so when you say that there have been these sort of antinatalist streams of thought in lots of other traditions, I mean, the Shakers come to mind, who antinatal themselves literally out of existence as a group. But that's a different kind of thing than what you must be talking about, right? So the Shakers, for those who don't know, had a sort of doctrinal prohibition on reproduction, and so they flatly ceased to be as a people. And is that the kind of antinatalism you're finding in Eastern and Western traditions, or is it a different kind?
Well, there's all different kinds. I mean, even looking at contemporary antinatalism, which isn't actually in the book a lot, but I've read around in a decent amount. There are very different understandings in that work of why humans shouldn't reproduce. Some of them are not anti-life, some of them think that human life can be enjoyed, but maybe it's an environmental kind of argument about the preservation of other species. Some of them are quite gentle, that there is a kind of peaceful ceasing that's there. And then some of them are very aggressive. They're really about genocide in a way, or species mass extinction that's being proposed. So I don't know that I want to equate all of them. I feel like there are a lot of different strains of thought that are kind of coalescing in our particular moment. Some of them really deep, going into, some of them are early Christian versions of a kind of waiting for heaven, waiting for the afterlife. Some of them draw on Eastern traditions of kind of seeing life as this perpetual wheel of suffering. But even within those traditions, there are great variations, of course, that in Buddhism, to be born is to be chained to the rounds of suffering, but to be born a human is also a chance at liberation. So, you can't be too monolithic.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, so I guess we'd be curious how you understand the role of suffering of various kinds in one's posture towards birth and towards life, for a couple of reasons. I've just come back recently from my first trip to Africa, which I believe that in the country where I was, Uganda, the birth rate is an average of 5 children per woman. So a place of, in some cases, quite serious suffering and very serious poverty, and not by any means an antenatal civilization. And then, on the other hand, you have, I think a lot of people would look at, the tragedies of the 20th century, the catastrophes, and point to that as a reason why this is just not good what we're doing here, folks. Right? And then, very interestingly, you have Hannah Arendt as a main sort of spokesperson for Natality. So how do you understand this sort of relationship between suffering and tragedy on the one hand, and then attitudes towards life and birth?
Yeah, I think that part of the irony is that we see in communities that have suffered a lot throughout history, very often those are communities that are more strongly pronatal or sort of affirmative of human life. I think it's because, they've had that threatened. Hannah Arendt talks a lot in her work about, the kind of sheer awe at the miracle of life. And for her, that was, because she had survived the Holocaust and she knew that many of the thousands of women she was interned with were annihilated. And so I think that sense of life as this tenuous, precious thing was more accessible to her. I think in cultures where we're just kind of going through your day is a dangerous experience, and where lives are kind of cycling in and out with greater frequency, birth is sometimes embraced more. And it certainly does, I think, have to do with suffering, because there's a lot of suffering that goes along with birth. Arendt talked about, in the modern world, this irritating incompatibility between our ability to control our worlds and the sense that we are increasingly unable to act or to be agents in our societies. So on the one hand, we're sort of masters of our universe, and we go around in these climate-controlled environments, and we put our seatbelts on. We have these all these safety measures, and of course we're not safe, and we have guns in our streets, and we all feel that. But there's also this kind of buffering, I think, that happens in places where there are affluence and political, cultural power and access to resources, and that those make birth a harder experience for us, because we are, we're trained to be masters or victims. There's not this sense of being in between. And birth, I think, always is in that in between where it's humans kind of in the very process of creation and making things, beginning a new life, and somehow believing that that life is going to be good, but also understanding that their power within all of this is supremely limited.
Yeah. I wonder if there's something about secondhand suffering that is especially sort of devastating. What I'm thinking of is so Adorno after the Holocaust says, famously says, after Auschwitz, it's barbaric to write a poem, right? You never could, right? On the other hand, we know that people were playing music like to console themselves in and I've read some ethnomusicologists who believe that song is invented as a mourning tool, right? Mm-hmm. That the community breaks up, or the community has experienced some fracture because one of our members has passed away, and we reknit ourselves together again with music. There are other sort of literary examples you can point to. The Brothers Karamazov is always on my mind. But yeah, I wonder if there's something special about, or not so much running through the mud of suffering myself, but like knowing about suffering, right? That puts it in a different light. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, it's a collective experience, something that's shared and that we're in a way taught. I think it's notable that the communities in the U.S. that most strongly affirm birth children, who value the experience of being a parent the most highly, are also the communities that have the worst birth outcomes, have the highest rates of mortality in childbirth. Yeah. That's a hard thing, I mean, it goes against what many of our assumptions would be. And yet I think these are also communities that have suffered. And so there's not always as much fear about the suffering that childbirth entails. And there's also a kind of joy that comes with the new life that also comes out of it. There's a recognition, and somehow that the gift of birth is somehow sweeter for such people.
So interesting. I mean, I've written before that Americans might be the least tragic large group of humans ever assembled, right? Not that we don't experience suffering, because everyone suffers. Life is packed full of it, but we suffer, but we're not tragic in that we don't sort of understand that it is inevitable and has to be lived through, right? We have this sense like, this is not fair, like what's going on, right? At least those of us who, are lucky enough to live in certain kinds of communities, have certain amount of physical comfort, to just imagine that, like, if there is suffering, like something's gone wrong, right? Someone didn't do their job, something's not been properly prescribed or something like that.
Yeah, I think of my grandmother. I think about this a lot. Her first husband died in World War I, and she was basically destitute and had very limited options. And she met my grandfather, and they got married, and she had her first child. She had about, I think, 8 miscarriages. And her doctor told her that if she tried to have another baby, she would probably die. And she left the office, and her husband asked her what the doctor had said. And she said, "I'm free to have as many babies as I want." And that was my mother. So my mother was her second and last child. And, I think what else did she have to live for at that point in history and in her own personal history? That's what she wanted, partly because she had experienced all these losses.
So in the book, one of the larger cases you're making is that birth should be more closer to the forefront of our imagination, right? Like, we're certainly a moral species, and that can never be entirely absent from our thinking. But then we should think a lot more about birth. And I wonder, that seems right. I wonder how closely for you that maps onto a lot of the sort of crises of morale that you kind of walk through in the book, especially in the epilogue. So there is a sort of, I think, a large and prevailing sense in lots of places that, like, there's just, we're kind of washed up here, like enough is enough. Like there's nothing really sort of new coming around the bend. And I mean, that leaves us in a weird position in a couple of ways. One is that it, as Arendt saw, like it makes us ripe for someone to come along with a vision of newness that is not good, right? Maybe we might be just sort of dispirited enough that we would just grab onto any old thing that came along. And, we just need to keep changing and moving if we're going to meet challenges and we're going to, persist as a species worth persisting. So I wonder, like, in the plainest language possible, like, what do you think can happen, right? Like, is it possible that, we could sort of reimagine our way? We could sort of have a change of heart right now, have a change of heart, and then out of that would flow, transformative newness. Like, I mean, what do you see as the sort of potential way out of the kind of morass that we're in?
I mean, I think it's a rehumanization that's needed, and a rehumanization that isn't about humans being the measure of all greatness, or of necessarily being more important than any other species. Where you seem to have like these two extremes of, the humans and we're humans, we're going to do what we're going to do, and look at our great civilization. And then you have this anti-humanism that's very strong in our moment. And I think really what is needed is to kind of come back to a creaturely sense of who we are, as limited, embodied, embedded, biological beings that exist as these tiny little specks that are part of something much greater. And for us to both value what that is and to see it as worthy of preservation as any endangered species, but to also consider it in relation to the rest of the created world, or, the rest of the cosmos. I think the humanization, rehumanization is the way I think about it. What goes along with that? For me, birth is so much a part of that, because birth gets at all of this in a way. It gets at our dependence on other people. It gets at our fragility, our vulnerability. It also gets at our potential, that we get to begin again, and we get to do all of these things and be creative. I think that, there are these really real questions now about what a human life is. And, we know that, we could perhaps be optimized out of existence, and that we're incredibly flawed. And for me, there is, in this moment, is like just strong desire to stay with those flaws. Some of it is I'll read 19th century novels and I'll read these sentences that I know would be like autocorrected now, or would be edited out with a word processor, or, for me, finding errors in books in a way, it's like, those errors that people made in these great tapestries in the Middle Ages, that because you were supposed to kind of admit that you weren't a god, you were a creator, but you were, human. The artifacts of human life are always flawed. There's something about that is so attractive to me now. I think those sorts of flaws, I think we are in this unforgiving age, and part of the unwillingness to forgive and to allow for human error is also part of this like increasing technology that's just improving us and correcting us and processing things better than we are. And so I'm finding I just want to be with people. I want to be with like organic things. For me, those have such strong pulls right now. And that may be part of what I'm proposing in the book, is that we kind of come back to that level and see what our lives are from that kind of, very kind of beginning organic place of emergence.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting when you talk about things that are organic and imperfect and handmade, because so much of the vast majority of the prosperity and the development and the technology and the comfort that's enjoyed in a place like Massachusetts it comes as a result of mass production and standardization and scale and all that. But then at a certain point in that growth, you get people who've made a lot of money during that process, and they tend to turn their money now towards getting the handmade and the imperfect, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's something made by hand by an imperfect craftsman now is like a premium sort of good. Which, I mean, sometimes gives me hope that, like, people, at least, people recognize that it's nicer to have, a bag that was made by, a craftsman who's one in a long line of bag making craftsmen. Like that's good. We still recognize that. I don't know, what practical future there might be where that becomes something that everyone can afford again. I'm not sure. And, a lot of the directionality seems to be going the wrong way right now. Maybe a year ago, it might be a little more now. I was talking with a group of students about the great stagnation, right? How across all sorts of sectors in American life, we're not making new stuff. We're not calling new ideas, right? This is academia. This is Hollywood movie studios, on and on. We seem to be kind of repeating old tropes right now. We're kind of treading water. And I asked them, okay, so what companies, what actors, who in American society are you aware of who's doing something genuinely new, like really trying to push forward and not just repeating what happened before? And the two answers were, at the time, Zuckerberg had just announced the metaverse, and Elon Musk was like shooting people up to the moon, or whatever he used to. And those were the sort of the genuine novelties they could think of in our society. And I thought it was like a reasonably fair estimation. But then if you think about that, I mean, those are both literally modes of escape, right?
Yeah.
They're both modes of escape from the kind of finitude that you're talking about. And one in this case is literally trying to get the hell off Earth.
I've thought a lot about this. This is Sputnik and, the beginning of the human condition.
I was not happy with it. Yeah, so I mean, again, sorry, this is a rambling question. On the one hand, I do see a correction where people are like, oh, like, let's not get so far away from just being like an embodied person around embodied people using things made by other embodied people, right? So you see that, but then, and I don't fully understand it. And what I do understand about it, I don't like this like urge to be like, let me live in the metaverse. Let me get out of this muck here, right? Like, let me get into some clean environment where I can fully design myself. But yeah, I mean, how do you think about those forces contending?
I'm not really proposing that we have more craft sections in our superstores. I think of the critique that V.S. Naipaul had of Gandhi, that, this post-independence India, the kind of rebellion against the colonial powers, and he was sitting at his spinning wheel and made Naipaul very mad. He said, the most of the country is starving, and we don't really need to go back to the spinning wheel. We need like industry to come in and improve our standards of living. So I'm not at all anti-technology or anti-industry. I think the question really is, what are our technologies doing for us? What is mass production? What are we mass producing? And, there is this incredible innovation going on in many technological realms, but who is it for, and what is it serving? And, what are the objectives? And, I think you'll, I'm sure, think a lot about this, just that, what AI is most likely to be used for is companionship. And, as a try, and certainly it's one of the areas that's taken off early is porn, that the desire for human connection. that it's coming in to stand in for that. Whereas it could be used for maybe finding cures for cancer or, all that money and resources. You have to believe that there are things that could be put towards that would actually be about addressing the real problems we have, not just kind of putting these Band-Aids on what human nature is and trying to make us just kind of blind. And I think what it comes back down to is that as long as we are in bodies, like on some level, we're going to have to keep coming back to that, into our senses, what we can see in a kind of three-dimensional life, which doesn't mean you don't interact with the rest of the world, but there has to be some point in a day, in your life where you're embodied, you're looking at what you can smell and see and hear around you. And on some level, that reality is important. It's part of what you're devoting your attention to. It's not necessarily everything. There may be a point where to be human really is to no longer have a body. It's hard to know what might be possible. But I think that, when you talk about escape, that's key. How much of what we are doing is really about trying to escape the conditions that we're still in.
Yeah. Do you think we reach a sort of saturation point at some point? So I won't be able to quote it precisely, but there's that speech at the end of Brave New World. They're offering him all this comfort and this soma, this pleasure, and he's like, I don't want all that. I want sin. I want death. I want God. I want pain. In our lifetime, we've been getting phenomenally better all the time at trying to insulate ourselves from all that, right? Through pharmaceuticals and entertainment, and et cetera, et cetera. Do you think we hit a point where we're like, enough, like I need to get back out and touch a tree in a person? or are we malleable enough that we can just keep sailing into the ether forever?
Yeah. I don't know. My hope is that there's a pulling back. I sense it just in my conversations with people. I think if you look at where things are going, that's not necessarily all true. Although, I think social media platforms are, have had kind of declining rates of use. I don't know. This is kind of based on things I've read maybe 6 months ago. I don't know exactly up to the moment where we are with this. It seems likely that if we've all been trained on these things, that there will be new things that come along that do something slightly different, but better and more satisfying. And so I don't know that I really can't optimistically predict that that's not going to sweep us away. But I think what most concerns me, again, isn't that there will be technologies and that there will be this inorganic element of our lives, but that those things that come along are basically going to be built to benefit a very small handful of people. And the rest of us are sort of at the mercy of it. And to resist it, there will need to be that kind of individual agency, to not always go for the quick fix and the thing that comforts and soothes. And
there has to be courage to sort of make judgments too. So this is something Arendt talks about, right? The sort of like, I think maybe initially in relation to Eichmann, this sort of like laying down of judgment, right? Like just being part of a bureaucratic machine and not exercising judgment anymore. And I think that in terms of a tech economy, that basically, like, if you can get lots of users to engage, you just made a success, right? Period. We're like, oh, you're a billionaire. You must be a very successful, smart, cool guy, right? Like, and the only criterion we're employing is like, can you increase shareholder profit? And so in order to do that, you need to get lots of eyeballs, right? So we can sell ads to them. Like, that cannot be a way to run such a massive part of our lives, right? Just according to that one thin criterion, like, could you shareholder profits? Oh, you could? Like, you're the best, right? Yeah. Like, we're going to have to, like, and part of this to me is like the waning of a neoliberal paradigm where that was kind of, we could at least agree on that much, right? Like, I don't know about, what's sort of best and worst in life, but like, I know that we should all compete and you should be able to make your money and let the economy kind of run on its course and not interfere with it too much. Like, that gets you to products that are just bad for you, and they're very good for the shareholders, but bad for everyone else. And we have to be able to take up different standards.
Yeah, I think there's a sense that the government is running itself or being run by other people, and that that it's really lost touch with the people, the country, and what they want. And that's a fault of the government. It's also a fault of all of us of kind of letting things happen. I think that even the fact that some of the developments in AI aren't being they're being undertaken with an understanding of profound risk, like to the whole planet, and there's very little regulation of it. That it seems like people are just kind of conducting these wild experiments. We know how little social media companies were regulated, and some of it is this kind of anti-regulation ethos. But we should be the ones who are deciding how these things work.
That makes sense. Yeah. Okay. Well, Jennifer, this is great. Apart from the fact that people should most definitely obtain a copy of Natality, Towards the Philosophy of Birth. Any final word before we sign off today?
Well, I think my hope is that the book will generate conversations. And, I think for most people, if they were to listen to this talk, they'd go in not thinking that the discussion of birth would go into the kinds of topics that we've gone into. But I think as you start going in there, there's really so much there that really, really needs to be discussed. And birth provides a really unique perspective on all of the things that we are wrestling with. So I hope that people will have conversations, and public conversations, private conversations, but just to begin to really try to work through some of this and talk through and think through together collectively.
Jennifer, thank you so much. It was a real pleasure, and hope to see you soon.
Good to talk. Take care.
Each episode of Capita in Conversation is produced by Michael Bettis and is available by podcast wherever you get your podcasts, as well as capita.org.